Welcome to America's Talking. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. America's Talking is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. Today, we'll be discussing another sports topic on this episode of America's Talking, the controversies, the realities surrounding name, image, and likeness in college sports and how that might even impact high school sports and potentially the taxpayer. Joining me to discuss this today is three reporters from the Center Square. JD Davidson, who's a regional editor. JD, thanks for coming on America's Talking.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
We have Jon Styf, who, John, you come back for every sports show we do on here. John, welcome back.
It's a topic I know.
We also have Steve Wilson, who's a regional editor down in Mississippi. Steve, we were talking about before. I mean, do we like the nickname Mississippi Steve, or is that, we don't like that?
I think I can go with that. I mean, we're kind of sports crazed down there, so I guess my participation in this makes a lot of sense.
SEC Steve, that kind of rolls off the tongue.
That works. Alabama grad.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Well, speaking of which, Alabama grad, Nick Saban just retired, and I think this topic is part of what pushed him into retirement. NIL, name, image, and likeness policies. John, I'm going to start with you. This has been a topic with the NCAA, college athletes, amateur athletes across the board. What we're really talking about is, for a long time, college athletes could not capitalize on their own name, image, and likeness in a traditional way that like a professional athlete could, although the school could do marketing activities around the athlete. This has been a contentious issue for a long time, which is that blurred line between an institution capitalizing off of the efforts of an individual, but the individual not really being able to personally capitalize off of it like you would think for more professional athletes, things like that. So, John, there's been legal issues. The NCAA has shifted in recent years to allow NIL policies. Can you provide just an overview of the recent court rulings affecting the NCAA and transfer rules and these NIL policies?
Right. So in 2021, there was an Alston decision that essentially opened the door to, okay, athletes can get paid for this stuff. And part of that was a concurring opinion from Justice Brett Kavanaugh that said, one of the issues with this is antitrust with the universities and trying to close off some of the availability they have to NIL. So the NCAA then went and tried to create all kinds of guiding rules for NIL for when athletes can be available to transfer and then play. They decided, okay, you can transfer one time, then you can play. If you transfer a second time, you need to get a waiver. And the waiver process is crazy and it's inconsistent and all these things. So out of that Kavanaugh concurring opinion saying, hey, antitrust is an issue in this, a bunch of different states have decided to challenge that. Tennessee got upset that they were looking into the NIL rules there. So they filed a lawsuit claiming antitrust. They've succeeded. They've blocked all the NIL rules around it that essentially were preventing athletes from making deals until they commit to a university. And the same thing happened with West Virginia and Ohio with transfer rules. They didn't like the fact that they had basketball players or athletes who couldn't compete right away after their second transfer, didn't get the waiver. They filed the antitrust lawsuit. They have succeeded on that. And the NCAA now has essentially lost all of its power, and they know that they're not going to win these antitrust cases. So now they're trying to go to Congress and push legislation that, like with the major professional sports, they can have some level of those agreements.
There's a lot of people hanging around nowadays that are a little upset that the same things that they were doing and got slapped with show cause rulings from the NCAA are. A guy I knew in Alabama, Jeremy Pruitt at Tennessee, would be one of them. Jim Trussell here in Ohio would be another. Where all of the sudden, things that landed you on probation, now anybody can do.
And JD, you just kind of alluded to this, but we're seeing massive changes in a short time period. And then you're seeing the fallout of how do you actually put any real restrictions around this? It's causing issues, certainly for schools, athletes. The dots are all there and they're pretty easy to connect. Of all of a sudden, you could have a billionaire donor to the school come in, throw it in the NIL side, and have that side basically compensate the athlete to recruit them to their school. It's what's happening.
There are absolutely no rules now. At the moment, I'm all for it. Ohio State landed just about everybody that it wanted out of the transfer portal and in recruiting because of their collective. I listen to a lot of sports talk radio around Columbus. They talk a lot about the collective. The collective. That's the group that comes up with the money for Ohio State, and you don't know who's part of it. And some of the radio hosts in Columbus are part of it. They're ex-NFL guys, ex-Ohio State guys. And when it comes up on their show, they shut it down. They will not talk about it. But it is, it sounds so cliche, but right now in college athletics, it is the wild, wild west. And we're going to talk about football and we're going to talk about basketball, but it's the wild, wild west in field hockey. And it's the wild, wild west in men's and women's soccer. And you can go grab people however you want to with as much cash as you want to. For God's sakes, SMU got the death penalty for this very thing. This very thing. Probably one of the greatest teams in college sports. And we're right where they were.
And Steve, so one of the things that's kind of interesting about this, JD mentioned, so you have this entire, all of a sudden, funneling of cash to athletes. And when you look at the professional athlete landscape, there is when you think about major sports, right, there's usually player unions. There are agents that have to be verified, representatives that you can use or not use and that sort of thing. Wild, Wild West, these are some of these, I'm going to call them issues that are going to arise where you have agents taking advantage of high school kids and probably making pretty bad deals for themselves because, hey, we're going to give you a big paycheck at 18. You might regret it at 25, but you're going to like it now. And then on the other side of that, you are seeing some amount of unionization coming up. And we saw this with Dartmouth's basketball team, actually.
Well, the interesting thing that I noticed about the bill that Senator Ted Cruz put out there was that players would not be employees. And this is something that the universities have wanted to avoid because we're talking about all these different things, NIL, the wild, wild west. You talk about something that would totally remake the landscape. If these players become employees, are they subject to the state's retirement system? Are they how is this even going to work? Because if you bring into the fact that they're employees, they're going to have all these protections. Who's to say that football players, coach, we're not going to do two-a-days. We're going to strike. What's to stop them?
That, and they're also public. For the most part, they're going to be public employees. Salaries then would have to be public. Any kind of negotiations would have to be public. And this was the best thing I heard last week after this Dartmouth thing came out. Somebody sent out a tweet, that's fine. You want to be an employee. Can we fire you after the 6-26 season then? If you were that bad? Which technically they can't be fired now. Scholarships are year to year, so you can be cut too. But if you're an employee now, what's going to happen? And then obviously, universities are probably the largest employers in most cities that they're in. Now major universities become the largest employers in the state. So the state, the taxpayers, are funding the largest employment system in each state at that point.
And John, one of the kind of interesting things about this, so oftentimes when we talk about NIL, you hear the SEC schools, you've got, Big Ten, you've got a bunch of big name programs inside of big name schools where you have a bunch of money coming in. Just personally speaking, Division II college baseball. My wife played Division II college softball. My dad played Division I baseball at Indiana University. I will tell you, none of those three sports generated much revenue for the school and are not Alabama football. So how does the Alabama footballs of the world, I mean, how does this impact them versus your D1 programs that don't make much money, your D2 schools, D3 schools? I mean, there's a lot more to college sports than Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan.
Well, first of all, almost every college in the country is going to tell you that they don't make much money on athletics. And anybody who has a business can tell you, well, how much money you make depends on how much you're spending on things, too. Those big universities spend a ton on their football programs, other things. But they're all choices. And so they're going to these hearings and they're saying, well, we're going to have to cut Olympic sports. We're going to have to cut the smaller sports if it comes to this. But when you start looking at those smaller schools that you're talking about, they may actually have to cut those things if they're paying everybody a certain amount. One of the things that came up in a U.S. House hearing today was, well, if everybody's going to be unionized, don't they all have to make the same amount of money if they're all the same level of employee? Like how does that work? You know, every athlete in every sport at a school makes the same amount of money. That gets expensive real quick. So how do they do it? I mean, I think the NCAA doesn't have that answer right now. I don't think there is a great answer. Nick Saban today suggested that they do revenue sharing with the athletes and not make them employees, so that the sports that make a ton of money, those athletes can make a portion of the money, but the other sports, if you're a swimmer or whatever, you're not going to make a large amount.
And JD, I mean, this is all interesting. You know, I'll use a pun. It's all interesting inside baseball talk, right? Because the reality is, you like sports. All of a sudden, college sports becomes more like pro sports. Every athlete is, pretty much a free agent at the end of each season. If I'm Joe Smith, I don't care much about sports. I don't care much about college sports, professional sports. Yeah, I see all this NIL stuff. Why should I really care about this and that it's happening?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to look at. One, college football is the second most popular thing in the country. So there are a lot of people interested in that. The other thing is we've talked for decades about the cost of education, whether it's K-12s or, secondary education, post-secondary degrees and things like that. The more money that is spent in athletic departments, the more the normal student is going to have to pay going to school. It's just that simple. Anybody can talk all they want about how this money doesn't affect the typical student at Ohio State or Alabama or Kenyon College, which is the most expensive university in the nation, 3 miles down the road from my house. It's going to go up the more they have to spend. John was right. It's a choice on what you spend your money on, whether it's in my house or in your house or in my football program or in my lacrosse program. You've got to get that revenue somewhere. And the easiest way to get that revenue is going to be in tuition hikes. The second easiest way to get that money is you're going to go to state legislatures and say, we need more money to build this science building, or we need more money to pay our teachers. The money in a lot of these schools is there to do that if they choose not to spend it on athletics. That gets lost in all of this. Every public university has gone to their legislature this year and asked for more money this year than what they got last year. Where's their spending going? If the bulk of that spending is going into athletics, some of that money could be funneled in to save some taxpayer money.
Steve, you are down there in the South. You're in Mississippi, as I mentioned. I mean, that is sports country. And when we talk about NIL and stuff like this, it's in particular down in the SEC, this has become a big topic of discussion, right? I mean, college athletes are now free agents, big time free agents. I mean, that's basically what they are. What are you hearing? I mean, it might be different for somebody sitting up in North Dakota that's not a huge sports country versus somebody who's in the heart of this discussion, in the heart of 10 NCAA football teams that are always in the conversation of being in the football playoff. I mean, what's it like on the ground there with all this?
I would say that the biggest thing is it used to be back in the good old days, you had what were called the bagmen. You would leave your truck or your car unlocked at a certain time, and these people would appear and you would have a sack of cash under your seat. Now, the bagmen don't have to hide. They don't have to deal in cash. They just go to a collective, which I like what JD said about that. I was a big Star Trek fan. They had the Borg collective. You will be assimilated. Well, the problem with all of that is when you have this collective is who's responsible. And here's another thing I guess I forgot to mention about the public employees thing. Are these collectives subject to public records requests? Because if you're paying these guys and they're employees and they're getting paid by collectives, can we use public records laws to find out if the quarterback is getting $1.5 million and if one of the offensive linemen who's blocking for him is only getting a couple hundred?
There's going to be a lot of people not wanting that information out.
And John, we kind of touched on this a couple weeks ago. John, you were on here talking about professional sports stadiums, right? And all the taxpayer dollars going to subsidize new stadiums in big cities. And we kind of ended that discussion by saying it seems like it's going to be this way in perpetuity until it's not. I mean, there was no real light at the end of the tunnel to say this is going to change. It's kind of always been this way. So this is kind of different. You have something that has always been that way. You have a rule change, and now things are changing and changing fast. Do we think there is going to be legislation, government action coming in to try to regulate this, or is the NCAA just going to have to wield its power in the best way it can, which at the moment it doesn't have much?
They're not going to get any back, and they're not going to win more back in the courts. I think that's clear. They know now that they need somebody like Ted Cruz. They need somebody like the House Republican Committee to come in and say, we're going to fight for some level of amateurism. We're going to fight for some level of accountability. We're going to fight for some level of fairness in this process. Because if you have a system where there's no rules and it's a free-for-all, that's going to impact your viewership. It's going to make the playing field more unfair than it already is. I mean, there has to be some level of rules, and it seems like the only way you're going to be able to do that is through federal legislation, because so many holes have been cut through it in the courts at this point. The NCAA and the schools know they're not going to win in the courts. So they need somebody to push something.
And I'm not even sure that works, because the only threat then becomes, okay, well, if you receive federal money, then you have to do this. And if you can work around a lot of stuff at a university, you can probably work around receiving the federal money if you wanted to. So it looks like professional sports, but there's one thing missing from college sports that I think every professional sport league has, and that's a salary cap. And until you get to that point, you're going to get the 10, 12, 15 schools that have the most money. They're going to keep going and keep going and keep going. And the NCAA tried a salary cap before. It was scholarship limitations. And that kind of created some parity. I don't know how you do a salary cap here, but it's the only thing that's going to stop it.
Well, it's the Major League Baseball problem. There's a great quote in Moneyball, right, where there's, Billy Bean's talking about, he says, there are rich teams, there are poor teams, and there's 50 feet of crap, and then there's us. And that is coming fast to college sports. And Steve, one of the things I think is, I'm going to call it alarming, because to me it is. But one of the things that I think is alarming about this is the Pandora's box is now open, and you've got, guys, listen, college sports were always considered amateur. That was always the line. That's how the NCAA, flawed, good, bad, people have different opinions. That was the verbiage that was used. That's what they stood on. High school sports are next. AAU is next. I mean, this isn't going to stop at college sports? What's the implications if this just keeps going down that hierarchy of professional to college to high school to middle school to AAU? The running joke was always, I didn't know so many great athletes were Catholic. That was just kind of how it was. They somehow all converted to Catholicism when it was convenient to win a state championship. There was always the wink and nod of that. It feels a little more uncomfortable to me when it's so out in the open to a pay for play of a 16-year-old stud athlete. That just feels weird to me.
I think what's going to happen is you're going to have the athlete unmoored from the educational institution. And I think what's going to happen, when I was in Vicksburg, Mississippi, I was the sports editor, and they had 3 exchange students who somehow showed up and were all splendid soccer players. I have no idea how this coach managed this. But the interesting thing, and I was not aware of it, is they don't have athletic programs attached to their academic institutions. Instead, you have clubs. And I think what's going to happen is this is going to be the death of prep athletics as we know it. And I think this is going to be the rise of a club system. And I think everyone's going to be poor for that. That's a shame. I hate that because I feel like that the Friday night lights bring communities together. And when it's just some atomized club from somewhere where they just draw in a bunch of, to put it bluntly, mercenaries, people just aren't going to get behind it.
So we're already seeing that in Ohio. 2 years ago, the Ohio High School Athletic Association, in full disclosure, my hobby is I'm a high school football, basketball, and baseball official. I have a baseball game to work this afternoon, actually. 2 years ago, they put a vote out to their members, and all of these athletic associations in every sport, whether it's the UIL in Texas or the Alabama High School Athletic Association or the OHSAA in Ohio, they're exactly like the NCAA. They're member-driven. They kind of run these championships, and they make their money on the championships and all of that kind of stuff. They asked their members if they wanted to allow NIL in high school in Ohio. The members voted no. Well, since then, there has been one basketball player leave his school team to go to an academy that's not part of the OHSAA, and he was sent there by Adidas. So he could be paid by Adidas and then funneled through Adidas's summer programs and then funneled to an Adidas school in college. Also, the defending girls Division I state golf champion just announced she was a sophomore last year. Now she will no longer play high school golf. So she can get paid to play golf. I expect the next vote in Ohio will be to allow NIL. And you're going to see things like we're going to be able to give you a pizza after a game and stuff like that in some small rural communities. But it's going to grow. It's going to explode. And then you start talking about, well, now you're going to talk real taxpayer money when you're pulling in an entire football team with cash. Where are you going to put these kids as students? This is not far away. It's not far away at all. Cool. And I'm going to want more money for officiating at that point too.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Full disclosure, I'm a volunteer high school baseball coach as one of my hobbies when I get around to it. And there is not a ton of money, there. I mean, just in those systems for referees, umpires, whatever, there's just not a lot of, and unfortunately too, there's a shortage, an increasing shortage of people that want to do what you do, JD. And I can't help but think that the more and more that this becomes, like college sports and professional sports, the more entitled the kids will get, the more it will push people away from wanting to coach, umpire, be involved in the athletic system in general. And I think the thing we didn't talk about today, but I think is important to mention, everybody we talked about is a student athlete. And the student aspect of that has, at least in theory, supposed to have been the primary aspect of that deal, right? And that athletics is attached to the school because it is considered an educational tool. I mean, that's the justification, is that in extracurriculars and in sports, you can teach things that you cannot really teach in a classroom in the same way, so that there's an educational benefit to having sports attached to an educational institution. If this becomes a pay-for-play scheme across the board out in the open, I mean, Steve, I think you're probably right that the club sport is the way it's going to go. And the reality is, if you do it that way, it's going to make sports even harder to become part of. It's going to make it a more elite extracurricular activity, and you will have fewer kids involved. I mean, we see this in baseball all the time. All of a sudden now you got to have a, $400 or $500 bat, to play baseball. That eliminates a lot of kids and a lot of families.
Yeah. And one of the differences is when it bleeds down into high school and middle school, you're talking about a group of people now that are forced to be at school. In college, you choose whether you want to go to college or not. When you're talking high school and middle school, you're forced to be at school. Whether it's school choice or public school or whatever, you have to have your kid in school. And as a student, you have to be in school. And not getting the opportunity to even experience some sort of extracurricular because this is all happening cheapens an education experience.
And there was the thing, too, there was a sign, I remember. It said that the athletic field was an extension of the classroom. And if you lose that connection with the schools, you're going to lose that. And that's a shame.
That's a huge point, because the National Federation of High School Sports, one of their core things they talk about every season, every year, is it's an extension of the classroom. They talk about it in terms of behavior, but it's still an extension of the classroom.
And the wild, wild west of NIL may be coming to a community near you. And I think that's the reality. And if it's not going to come to the high school level anytime soon, it's certainly going to come to your local colleges and things like that. So, guys, I want to thank all three of you for joining us today on America's Talking to talk about this subject. It's a fascinating one close to my heart. Again, I think there's not going to be an easy solution to this, and like it or hate it, it's going to have to come from, as Jon said, something like what Senator Cruz put in. It's going to have to come from top-down legislation, because the wild, wild west is going to be wild until it is not. Thank you all for joining us. And for you listeners, if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to go to americastalking.com and check out our other podcast. I'm Cole McNeely. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next time on America's Talking.
Get creative with Skillshare. Explore thousands of hands-on creative classes with one inspiring membership. Watch, play, learn, discover. Follow the link in our show description to join Skillshare today and get 1 month free.